Welcome to the module on International Development and Exploration. In the context of international development, it is one of the core issues of global governance. By the term global governance, we mean that the economy is struggling for making an economic order in terms of the governance issues, which comprise of rule of law, political stability, and accounting standards. A global governance model will address the socio-economic issues and also the political issues simultaneously. This goes back to the late 1960s when the Pearson Commission acknowledged that the most important crucial policy issue across the globe is the widening disparity in the standard of living and other economic parameters between the developed and the developing countries. And so it has become a central issue of our time. This also interested the policymakers to come up with some resolutions and policy decisions taking care of the political scenario of the economy. Moreover, in the year 2000 and in the month of September, the declaration adopted by 147 heads of the state and the government of United Nations Millennium Summit, which has identified the most important social cause would be the fight against poverty. Because the poverty was considered to be multidimensional in approach. It was not following the traditional view that only the right to income or an individual is below the poverty line because measured in terms of consumption expenditure. But poverty has a more higher dimension or it has a broader dimension in terms of different parameters. So poverty is perceived by the multidimensional poverty index as proposed by the UN in terms of deprivation. And this deprivation is in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of health standards, and definitely in terms of per capita income. So based on that, fight against poverty has been the global cause of the United Nations and later on taken up by all the countries across the globe. Now we follow up on the debate of development, which is based on some of the constructionist approach across the two major apex bodies. One is the United Nations and another one is the Bretton Woods system. So this goes back to the development debate which has been apt for the developing countries today. Firstly, it goes to the constructionist approach. This is stressing the importance of ideas and ideologies in accounting for social processes. Here, social process refers to the social transformation in terms of upliftment of the society from a very poor standard of living to a good equilibrium. So this also takes care of better coordination among the policymakers, better coordination among the stakeholders, and a networking system. Thereby, all the members of the society will be inclusive and getting the benefit, and thereby calls for a proper ideological setup. Secondly, ideas not only provide conceptual roadmaps and collective images to guide human behavior, they also frame issues. So whenever the creation of new ideas takes place, and that is how the innovative model crops on, it actually provides some roadmaps for the future growth. And these roadmaps are highly convenient for any policy making. As a result, human behavior also will be affected in terms of understanding the relevance of merit goods, and thereby the coordination failure may come to an end. And not only that, ideas also will guide the policymakers to frame issues, frame policies and resolutions for a safe and sustainable future. To a large extent, political interests themselves can be viewed as ideal. So the concept of ideal political interest refers to a democratic system, refers to an economy where both socialistic and capitalistic frame of mind will exist, and thereby this approach will become more and more methodological. Moreover, given that ideas are expressed primarily through language, and the naming structures in reality has shown strong interest in the discourse analysis. This is very much important in terms of the policy making and framing of the policies taking care of the understanding of the common man. And that also is the role of the state in a welfare-oriented manner. How can ideas become more expressive and comprehensive for the general masses of the society? This gets into the debate on the convergence among the multilaterals. because thereby when the trade comes in and some of the multilateral organizations participate, the concept of convergence crops in. Firstly, the consideration is on the current climate with the multilateral development system is much more harmonious than that which prevailed in the 1980s and early 90s when civil war was over and structural adjustment was in process. This is very much evident for any third world economy. All the third world economies have undergone a reform process within the time period of 80s to 90s, maybe earlier or later. And this structural adjustment, which was basically the suggestion or the recommendation of Washington Consensus, was basically building the economy through a reform process with price stability. So structural adjustment program was twofold. It looks into the macroeconomic stabilization and also the structural reforms. So based on that, multilateral development strategies were adopted and it was harmoniously accepted by all the third world nations in terms of reform package. And that made convergence across all the nations to develop together and usher in a balanced growth. Secondly, although the optimism that marked the Millennium Summit has somewhat diminished because of the political tensions generated by war or terrorism, cooperation and dialogue between the Bretton Woods institutions and UN agencies are more intensive today than any other point in the past, which implies that the objectives of Millennium Summit was fight against poverty, making the growth to be more sustainable and inclusive. However, different countries have not embraced these policies in a very friendly manner because of political tensions or because of any kind of frictions that will prevail across the economies. So that was affecting the terrorism or war, and so the dialogue between UN and Bretton Woods was continuously conflicting, and finally it ended up with a convergence. The Bretton Woods institutions now acknowledge that the disparities between the world's richest and the poorest nations are wider than ever. This was also the finding of Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate in economics, who said that after globalization, the disparity between the rich and poor has widened over time, and that was also responsible for creating some kind of superpowers or polarized growth pattern. This boils down to more and more insights on the convergence among multilaterals. The new development consensus of 2000 Millennium Declaration, where the benefits of globalization are very much unevenly shared. So this was a common view of all the policymakers across the globe that globalization might have a lot of benefits or optimistic vision, but the most important consequence was that rise in the disparity or inequality across the nations, where the richer nations are used to have a dominating power over the poorer nations, and thereby a leader-follower relationship evolved. The Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, include achieving universal primary education. So MDGs came in place, which was adopted by all the economies across the globe to address mainly the socio-economic issues. Among them, the first important point was education for all. That is universal primary education, which can be the agent of social transformation. Promoting gender equality. This is taking care of the gender discrimination and also empowerment of women. So gender equality is one of the most important goals even today followed under Sustainability Development Goals, which looks after gender, health and nutrition as one of the severe goals. Reducing child mortality. This is actually looking into the child health and also the maternal health in concern. Improving maternal health, halting the spread of infectious diseases. This is also the use of vaccine or any kind of immunization programs which can take care of eradication of these infectious diseases or communicable diseases. Ensuring environmental sustainability. This is taking care of the resource management or the energy sector, which takes care of renewable and non-renewable sources of energy to be utilized in an efficient manner, and developing a global partnership for development. This calls for global treaties or global agenda which can actually capture most of the countries as a group to address these objectives of MDG. The declaration adopted at the Monterrey Conference on Financing the Development confirmed the importance of MDG, which was articulated in the Millennium Declaration, and it was considered as one of the goal of 21st century, that is development for all. So development for all is very much in tune with the inclusiveness which calls for shared, participatory and pro-poor growth pattern, taking care of education, gender, health and other upliftments as given. This boils down to what can be the norms of convergence. Because every nation wants to work on certain criteria based on which convergence can be built up across every country across the globe in order to have a harmonious way of living. The first norm of convergence should be more inclusive and equitable. This is very much apt for Indian economy also, where inclusiveness was taken up after 11 5-year plan, and with the current economic policy also is working on engaging a larger segment of the population. This also goes into the JAM project of the Government of India, which calls for Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar and mobile banking, and thereby linking every segment of the population through a unified network system through unique identification number. Also, the growth should be more equitable. Secondly, each country has primary responsibility of its own. So this calls for the responsibility of the stakeholders of the nation who are very much crucial in the decision-making process, and so the growth should follow a decentralized mode of planning. Thirdly, economic and social development. This is one of the most important parameter of building up the domestic foundations, that is the basic pillars of growth. Development should primarily rely on private flows because it is seen that most of the government funding is scarce. So this looks for attracting private investment, which should be complementary with domestic investment and not the crowding out of domestic investment. In Indian economy, most of the times it is observed that wherever domestic investment is scarce, FDI comes in and fill in the space. But this should not be the ideological principle of attracting foreign capital flows. Moreover, trade is the main engine of growth and development. This calls for outward-oriented promotion strategy or export-oriented strategies, which calls for inflows of foreign capital, accumulation of foreign exchange reserves, and making trade to be the major driver of growth. And thereby, the trade participation and international competitiveness can be enhanced. Aid should be seen as a complement to other sources of development financing. This also calls for receiving aids from various national and international agencies which can finance the model of investment. Debtors and creditors must share the responsibility for solving unsustainable debt situations. So whenever the economy will be experiencing any sort of fiscal indiscipline, then the debtors and creditors must work hand in hand through a proper regulated capital market or a financial system. Thereby comes in the role of United Nations Development Programme, because these are some of the institutions which will be act as a catalytic role to promote harmonious way of living and making the norms of convergence to be effective. One of the institution is United Nations Development Programme, which has changed its structure, its functions and its administration over the years. Basically, it has won over a number of ideas defended by World Bank and OECD, that is Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. UNDP has thus embraced the view that since the early 90s, development has shifted away from aid as entitlement towards emphasis on results and performance. Earlier, the development strategy was basically on proposing the policies, but later on, the implementation and the results were become more targeted. Because if a policy is adopted, what is the consequence after 10 years or 20 years? So after evaluating the consequences, the policies were reframed and redesigned to suit the goals of MDG or SDG as of today. To promote result-based management, UNDP is endeavoring to make its services more competitive. This is very much crucial because result-based management is all in all. Whether the people are getting the benefits, whether the inclusiveness is actually achieved or not, and whether the policymakers are taking care of the nation, that is the major objective of the success of UNDP or any policies of United Nations. Moreover, in 2002, the participation of UNDP is extended to more than 60 countries and covered a wide range of subjects including trade, obviously finance, macroeconomic policy, and definitely monitoring of poverty. Because this poverty is always multidimensional, always it captures the concept of deprivation. Moreover, the general tone of UNDP's discourse is less confrontational than in the past because now the coverage is more broad and holistic. The growing tendency of UNDP is to describe the development issue as more technical than political and keeping the new pragmatism the UN agencies are striving to foster. Technical in the sense it takes care of the statistical data and also looks into the data and also wants to improve the standards rather than getting confined to a political judgment or a political rationale. Finally, it is striking that having recently introduced purchasing power parity in its measurement, UNDP now goes for global inequality rather than increasing but might be on the decline. Because whenever the parameters are adjusted with the currencies which are followed across the globe, the measurement becomes more and more robust and thereby there is a concern for reducing global inequality on average for all the nations across the globe. This basically gets into some of the observations on the ideological differences that existed between the UN paradigm and Bretton Woods paradigm. This is very much relevant because UN paradigm and Bretton Woods paradigm initially had some points of conflict and thereby they can come up for a convergence as it is seen in the new economic order as followed today. The first point that comes up is the debate from where it originated. The recent debate on the UN paradigm and the Bretton Woods paradigm signals a new stage in the evolution of the North-South relations. The North-South relations refer to the North and South blocks across the trade zones of the globe, where a stage that some have associated with the emergence of a global third way. That means we can take the example of World Trade Organization where the developed countries are benefited, developing countries are being dominated with the propositions of WTO in terms of subsidies and other factors, and thereby it has been seen that the dominance was enjoyed by the capitalist countries who used to leader out or who used to exercise control over the developing nations. It also implies a conceptual link. On the one hand, the global tension that opposes the Bretton Woods and the UN agencies to come up, and on the other hand, the domestic struggles putting the social groups favoring to new liberalism. So now we are going to address the points of conflict that originated. The first point of conflict attributes to the opposition of United Nations to the advocates of equality of opportunity who prefer market situations, and the Bretton Woods stress the need for redistributive measures. So it is said that initially whenever there has been some kind of euphoria or talks on the equality of opportunity for all, then the capitalist agencies or the capitalist countries who were the member of United Nations has opposed that because it made working class and capitalist classes to be at par and they prefer market economy to prevail, whereby the capitalists will enjoy the power and also the dictatorship over the working class. But the Bretton Woods were consistently stressing on redistributive measures, for example, poverty alleviation or redistribution of wealth or subsidy-related programs in a welfare-oriented state. So this was the very first point of conflict in terms of their ideological differences. Secondly, most international institutions involved in the global governance of development by various groups associated with the political center. That means it is said that most of the institutions or the countries which were the members of United Nations were dominated some kind of political center or political dictatorship, and that made them to follow a market economy and also get away from the resolutions of socialistic pattern. Aligning with the MDGs 2015. So developed countries have opened their markets to southern exports, particularly to the agricultural products, and a new financial architecture providing a sustainable solution to the debt problem. So it is said that the developed countries had opened up or adopted an outward-oriented strategy towards export promotion, and all these are very much instrumental for increasing their foreign exchange reserves, which can address their financial problem and also can go for a sustainable growth in the debt problem. So this was very much in tune with the alignment to the MDG goals of 2015. So in this new economic order, a much larger number of countries and individuals would benefit from the global capitalism. That means the UN is actually in favor of ushering in a global capitalism across the globe because they used to generate profit and they used to actually exercise control over the developing countries. However, most of the economies refuse to follow MDGs due to its reformist vision. Because it is said that across the globe, the advanced countries were ready to adopt an outward-oriented strategy, but most of the developing countries were showing some resistance, because they were not in a position to expose their domestic foundations to the international market, as because they will be washed away by the international competitive forces, mainly the forces of global demand and supply. So due to the reformist vision, there was some degree of resistance. So as a result of that, sluggish growth was observed, and this also widened the disparity between the rich and the poor. War against terrorism have made the countries of the North more reluctant to keep their promises in the field of trade and finance. So thereby, among the North-South relations, there has been deterioration in the growth pattern and also in their potentials. Now we move on to the second point of conflict. The second point of conflict involves the breakup of the new compromise and a move to a new order. The compromise had been that the developing countries had to be at the mercy of the developed countries because the capitalist nations always are preferring a market-oriented model, and thereby the new order has to come up in kind of a new revolution. So the global governance of the development would be increasingly shaped by the norms of self-help rather than by the norms of solidarity. This is very much important in terms of attaining self-sufficiency in the growth pattern. And that is what the self-sufficiency comes up when the global governance of the development is working on. In Indian economy, we had seen the self-reliant model with the introduction of Planning Commission in 50s. And also today we talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat, which talks about a self-sufficient model to come up. So that is also already embedded within the propositions of the new order. As a result, the world would become more unequal and polarized, a situation that would add fuel to the clash of civilizations. So if this kind of capitalist economies come up in a bigger shape, as it has been said, then the inequality and the polarization will be at its extreme, and that is one of the fear from continuous trend of globalization, even we have crossed 25 years after reforms. So inequality in the distribution of wealth will widen, and these are some of the threats or some of the risk factors associated with the dominance of capitalism in terms of market orientation rather than going for a convergence. So based on the conflict, there has been a call for convergence for a radical transformation across the economies. So the convergence calls for a radical transformation of the current development compromise, which calls for the redistributive measures which were stressed by the Bretton Woods institutions, like redistribution of global wealth, definitely takes care of the socio-economic issues, definitely takes care of sustainability in terms of creating safety nets, and also taking care of social protection, either in terms of cash transfer or kind transfer or universal basic income proposition. Democratization of international politics. This is also very much important, where the decisions of all the countries should be there, representation should be there from all the countries across the globe in the decision-making power. And promotion of environmental sustainability, which takes care of degradation of environment and also protecting the energy sector. So to foster such changes, global governance of development should be given a prominent role to third world nations, and also the disparity between the north and the south zones will be mitigated. So this trajectory, that is the path of development, would also lead to an overall strengthening of the role of United Nations agencies in the management of world affairs. So thereby we can see that the overall strengthening of United Nations model will come up and the management of world affairs will be more sustainable and safer. So thereby we go for futuristic policies. So in terms of futuristic policies, it is a balancing policy where state as well as the private sector will coexist in the era of globalization and in the era of changing dynamics across the globe. So firstly, maintaining a strong regulatory framework. A strong regulatory framework calls for good governance or more governance and less government, and encouraging companies of different countries for investment and competition in the local market. That means different countries should be given a level playing field to invest in the other nations. Thereby, the climate should be well designed and attracting factors should be given. For example, better infrastructure, good governance, better human capital, and other factors which can attract the private players and even taking care of the interest of local market. Then only it can be potential dangers of corporate power. That means in order to suppress the corporate power or power of the capitalist classes or to address the concept of polarized growth, this is how a state-oriented model will develop, definitely with the introduction of market forces and with the entry of private capital. A welfare-oriented approach is desirable as it is recommended in terms of international development in a holistic manner. So international development calls for foreign direct investment link investments with the objective of employment generation. This is basically for livelihood generation as well as for growth enhancing. Export promotion, basically FDI-led exports can also be instrumental to growth and ensuring good governance. This calls for political stability and other governance indicators. And in case of foreign direct investment, it has a high sunk cost, so exit is absolutely difficult, unlike other forms of unstable or volatile capital flows. So in this particular module, we actually concentrate on the concept of international development, which calls for the development for global governance, for a new economic order, and a sustainable and safer future for all countries across the globe, where the growth will be more inclusive and equitable and sustainable. Multilateral's hypothesis says the conflict between the United Nations and the Bretton Woods system in terms of the conflict of interest that have gathered among them. And thereby the views were presented where the United Nations actually prefer for a market-oriented model and Bretton Woods prefer for a welfare-oriented state. But finally, there was a call for a convergence which calls for futuristic policies in terms of welfare-oriented nation, and that is to be followed across the globe in tune with the MDGs and currently the Sustainability Development Goals for gender equality, health, nutrition, better standard of living, and definitely for good governance and sound infrastructure.